I was able to get a new farm pickup this year. Well, actually I was able to get a new 3-year-old farm pickup this year. That's about as new as it gets on our farm. But I really like it, and it's been a big upgrade from my previous ride. And with a new pickup purchase comes the justification for a new toolbox purchase. Right now, all my tools are loose in the toolbox, which is a real pain for finding the wrench I need. I decided to fabricate a tool organizer that would help me keep everything organized and sorted in the toolbox. Hopefully this will lower my time spent searching for the right wrench and increase my time spent fixing whatever's broken. I got the pickup up to the shop and started working on a game plan. I thought the first thing to do would be to take inventory on the tools I had and get them sorted. I got them loaded up and onto my welding table. I organized the wrenches by size, biggest to smallest, and made sure I had 2 of each. Then I organized my sockets and was a little surprised to find that I wasn't missing any. Then I got my toolbox out of the pickup and onto my welding table as well. The first thing I had to do was attempt to pound out this dent that I managed to get in my nice new toolbox within the first week of owning it. I had something heavy in the bed of my pickup roll forward at a stop sign and make a nice, instantly recognizable crunching noise. Serves me right for not taking the time to tighten things down. I placed a heavy piece of metal on the outside and used a hammer on the inside to flatten it, which worked pretty well actually. So this little bit of aluminum work here is what caused me to put off this project for about a month. I've only worked with aluminum a couple times, and I was really nervous I was going to ruin the toolbox with this little modification I needed to make. This upper step is where I wanted to place my socket tray, so I needed to notch it out. After marking the cut lines, I used the angle grinder to make the cuts, and then I used a flap disc to smooth it up a little bit. Now having notched out this big piece, I felt like both ends were pretty weak. One side was where the lift support was attached, with a lot of weight on it, and the other side held up the latch mechanism. So I cut out a gusset from the scrap I just removed, and nervously attempted to weld it in place. Like I said, I've only welded aluminum, I think, 3 times now, with hugely variable degrees of success. I really don't know what I'm doing, and I wish I was practicing on a piece of scrap instead of my new toolbox. Aluminum behaves so much more differently than mild steel does. I ended up having to position the toolbox in ways that gave me the easiest weld positions. Doing this, I was able to get an admittedly ugly, but I think somewhat serviceable weld. And it's still closed like it should, so pretty happy with that. Next I got to work on the socket tray. I cut out a piece of sheet metal with the plasma cutter. That would be the base of the tray. And cleaned up the edges with the grinder. I checked the fit in the toolbox, and it seemed alright. I wanted to put an edge around the tray, thinking it might keep things in place a little bit. So I used my poor man's metal bender to bend some 1-inch strips to 90-degree corners. I bent one side, and then marked and bent the other side. Then I started tacking it in place, and once I was happy with the fit, I went ahead and put some bigger welds on it. Next I laid out my sockets in a couple different configurations until I found one that I was happy with. I marked the centers and then center punched them. I drilled out the holes using the same size bit as the round rod I was planning on using. For the 1/2-inch drive sockets, I used 3/8 inch rod. But for the 3/8 inch drive sockets, I had to use 5/16 because they wouldn't fit on the larger rod. I put some thought into how I was going to keep the round bar straight up and down while I plug welded it from the underside. I cut a short piece of 2-inch square tubing and drilled a hole all the way through both sides of it. Sliding the piece of rod through it, then I could position it and clamp it in place. Now I knew the rod was straight, and I could slide it inward until it was recessed about 1/8 of an inch, giving me just a little room for a strong plug weld. I had to drill a couple more holes in my square tubing block to get into the corners of the socket tray, but I was able to use this process for all of them, and it worked really well. I figured out how high I wanted to cut them off at. I decided they should be about 1/4 inch lower than the tops of the sockets. I cut them off with the angle grinder. Cutting them off after they were welded in place worked well to keep them the same height versus trying to get them the same height from the beginning. And then I ground the welds on the bottom of the socket tray smooth so it would sit flat in the toolbox. I had to leave this space open for the lift spring, otherwise the lid wouldn't have closed, but the deep sockets fit behind it nicely. The next day, as I waited for the grass seed trucks to be filled, I started on the bottom tray where I wanted my larger wrenches to be stored. I took a similar approach, making the tray first and then laying out the wrenches and marking where I wanted the pegs to go. I decided on these that I would just weld the sides of the pegs instead of drilling through the tray and welding the bottom like I previously did. I also made a spot for a couple pipe wrenches and my hammer. The next thing I needed to do was build some brackets that would hold these trays in place, and I thought these brackets could also give my smaller wrenches a place to hang on the sides. I also made a short tray to hold my 3/8 inch drive deep socket set, just hoping to use a little more of the empty space right in front in the middle of my toolbox. I welded it to the underside of the socket tray, and it stored the sockets kind of out of the way, but still easily accessible. I cut some plate that'll go on the side of the toolbox, and then marked locations for the pegs. I didn't worry as much about getting these ones oriented perfectly. I just tacked them and then bumped them around with the hammer a little bit to get them lined up close enough, and then called that good. And I came back in and welded it solid. I welded a piece of angle onto the backside that'll sit on the lip of the toolbox. And then I drilled a couple holes in the corner of the socket tray that I'll use to bolt the side pieces on. I had to make everything small enough size that it would fit into the toolbox and then bolt together once it was in place, because the toolbox opening is a little narrower than the floor of the box. So it wasn't going to work to lower one solid structure straight into it. I used a piece of cardstock paper to make a template with the whole location. And then I transferred the template onto a piece of metal. And then once I had the bracket bolted on, I could weld it to the side plate. I cut another strip that will run down to the bottom of the tray and hold it in place. It needed a slight S-bend in it to get to the outside of the bottom tray, so I stuck it in the bench vise and gave it a couple precisely calculated whacks with the hammer. This also needed to have one side be bolted on. So I clamped the bottom in place and then welded the top to the side bracket, planning on drilling the holes in the bottom after I removed it out of the toolbox. That was the last bit of fitting I needed to do in place inside the toolbox, so I broke everything down and removed it. Luckily I didn't have to go too far for some wrenches to undo the bolts. I drilled the holes for the bottom tray. And then I marked some holes for my ratchets, extensions, and screwdrivers that I wanted to put in the front of the socket tray. I used my plasma to cut some square holes for the ratchets, and then drilled varying size holes for everything else. That was the last bit of fabrication I needed to do, so I came through and cleaned everything up with the wire brush, and then wiped everything down with some lacquer thinner to remove any oils. I hung them from the hoist and gave them a couple coats of paint. The next day I was ready to put it all back together for the last time. Got my toolbox up and into place. This box is built out of some nice thick aluminum and feels really sturdy, but it's nice that it's still light enough for me to pick up by myself. I started dropping in the different parts and getting it bolted together. I thought I was going to have to bolt the trays through the bottom of the toolbox in a couple places, but I found out that after locking all the pieces together, I think it was an odd enough of a shape that they kind of held themselves in place and they didn't move at all. I cut some anti-slip rubber mat material for the bottom tray. It wasn't a perfect fit, but I figured once the wrenches were in place that it would hold it down tight. I got the wrenches loaded back up and then found a new home for the rest of my tools on the sliding trays. I was so excited to be set up and have everything with me again. I was making way too many trips from the field back up to the shop to grab a random tool I needed. A little bit of organizational work goes a long ways, especially in my cluttered life, and I don't do it enough. Felt really good finishing up and closing the lid on this project.